welcome and good afternoon. We are excited to be able to welcome you to this, the final virtual lobby on the program for the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival for 2022. I'm Hazel Gold, professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and also Jewish Studies at Emory University. And I hope that this is going to be the next hour, roughly, a wonderful and really illuminating conversation about two interestingly related films that we've programmed this year. 1618, a Portuguese film, a historical reconstruction, and the contemporary documentary Xueta Island. So I hope you have your coffee in hand, and I'm going to pass the microphone over briefly to Amy Levin on the staff of the AJFF, who's going to give you some technical information as to how we're going to run today's lobby. So take it away, Amy.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you are here for this final virtual lobby. I think we're going to have a lot of really cool things to discuss about these two films. And I know that I'm looking forward to having that conversation and getting to mix these two films together historically. So I'm going to go through the technical things that you're going to be able to use to join our conversation. The first tool that you are going to want to use is the raise hand button, which you'll find located at the bottom of your screen in the reactions tab. You'll just click on that and click raise hand. Once you do that, then the facilitator will call on you. So that's Hazel will call on you. So that means make sure that your name is written as your actual name in Zoom so we can call you properly. And then you'll be able to unmute and ask your question, say your comment, something like that. If you want to engage that way. If you are not a fan of speaking aloud in the Zoom, that's totally okay. We're also going to be monitoring the chat, so you can always drop a comment or a question in the chat. We'll make sure to bring it up, and you can contribute that way. Another thing that you can use is the live transcription button. That's also located at the bottom of your screen. It's a little CC button there. And what that will do is allow you to have a subtitle of what's being said in the Zoom. Zoom is really great. It has a fabulous computer that will generate that subtitle for you. So if you need that accessibility, just click that, turn that on, and you'll be able to move forward with it. The next thing is that there's a reminder that if your camera is on, we can see you. And we love being able to see you because, of course, that's the only way we've been able to see you through this virtual festival. But we also understand that if you don't want to do that and you want to sip your coffee, behind the screen, that's totally fine. You can turn off your camera. And now for the non-technical disclaimers, if you will. We are operating this discussion on the assumption that you've seen both films in their entirety. So that means we will be discussing things that may be spoilers. And so I'm letting you know that now so that you've been warned. You know the job was dangerous when you took it, Fred. All right. And then the last thing is AJFF is a safe harbor for candid conversation. We want everyone to be heard and to voice their thoughts and opinions. We just ask that you do so respectfully. Of course, I have no doubts everyone that is in our audience of AJFF is wonderful and delightful, and we love you so much. So it's just a kind reminder, even though we know that you will. And that is all for me, and I will hand it back to Dr. Hazel Gold.
Thank you, Amy. Much appreciated. And I think with that, we are all technically at this point so used to Zoom, but it's great to review all of those rules. So that being said, I hope everyone has their coffee. If you're in your pajamas, you definitely can leave your camera off. And again, for anyone who's joined in a couple of minutes late, I want to say welcome, bienvenidos in Spanish, bem-vindos in Portuguese, and benvinguts in Catalan, because those are the languages of the films that we'll be talking about today. 1618 is, of course, a historical reconstruction of an event that occurred in 17th century Portugal in the city of Oporto, which was the seat of a very large Jewish community, or previously Jewish community, now all converts to Christianity, some authentically, others in name only, as the film shows. And the second film, Xueta Island, a contemporary documentary filmed on the island of Mallorca, discussing descendants of similarly converted Jews as a result of the Spanish Inquisition and the kinds of discrimination that they had faced from the 17th century all the way down to the present, and the way that some of these individuals in that community are re-embracing a long ago Jewish heritage. So to get things rolling, I was wondering, you don't have to talk, but could you use the raise hand feature in the participants button to let us know, raise your hand, if you have indeed seen both films, because I don't want to go into long discussions of what they were about if the majority of people have indeed seen both. So I'm going to take a look at my participants window. And oh, looks like some people have seen both films and other people not. Okay, so I will give a okay, I'm seeing some of these on screen as well. Okay, mixed bag. So let me just give you a very short synopsis in case you've only seen one of the two films, or perhaps none, but are just interested in the subject. 1618 was directed by Luís Ismael, Portuguese film director, and focuses on what was going on in Portugal in the early 17th century. Not unlike Spain, Portugal also instituted the Inquisition, but did so later. In Spain, the Inquisition was rolled out in 1478. So as you can see, that was well before the famous 1492 expulsion. In Portugal, the Inquisition was not actually incorporated until 1537 or 38. I always confuse the date. And that's very important because it means that for several decades, the Jews continued to live in Portugal in relative tolerance, and those who had converted, because Portugal, following Spain's lead in 1497, pressured by the Iberian monarchy in Spain because of a dynastic marriage between their two houses, Portugal also in 1497 passed an edict insisting that Jews either convert to Catholicism or be expelled from Portugal. But during those years between 1497 and the 1530s, when the Inquisition ramped up, those converts were left in peace in a way that did not occur in Spain, where the active persecutions began much earlier. What that meant was that the former Jewish community in Portugal, in many cases, although converting and outwardly conforming to the necessary religious protocols of Catholicism, were able to continue practicing in secret. And they were called either crypto-Jews, or in Spain, they were called Marranos. And the story of what happened to them is what is dramatized in 1618. A group of these crypto-Jews who continued to affiliate with their Jewish heritage in secret decided to plan an escape. And you have to remember that both in Spain and in Portugal, the ports were closed. The monarchs in both countries did not want these converts to leave because they were important economically. And that's something you see very clearly in 1618. So to be able to escape, they had to do the planning in secret, they had to get a ship and so forth. And the story that is retold in 1618 is of, spoiler alert, a successful escape of a number of these members of the crypto-Jewish community in Portugal who were bound for, in this case, Amsterdam. The Netherlands and Belgium, Antwerp, were London as well, were locations that received many of these crypto-Jews who fled Portugal, as they did Spain as well. The situation in Spain is a little bit different. There, the Inquisition was brought in by the Catholic kings, as they're known, Ferdinand and Isabel, the same monarchs who basically paid for the expedition of Columbus to the New World. And they brought in the Inquisition quite early in 1478. And the Inquisition there was operating before the expulsion. And I suppose another factoid that I should bring up is that, and this is a common confusion that my students have, and I have to explain this, and it's not well known. The Inquisition, neither in Spain nor in Portugal, never actively pursued or persecuted Jews. It was simply not allowable for the Inquisition to investigate, persecute, or punish members of a different religion. The Inquisition was established to root out heresy. And so among others who were targeted, that included the converso or converted population of former Jews who could be investigated and prosecuted as heretics if there was an accusation of the suspicion that they were worshiping the law of Moses in secret. Then they were heretics and they were apostates because they had already taken baptism and had been ritually converted and were, in name at least, supposed to be faithful Catholics. So that is an important point to bring up. In Spain, the Inquisition was active very early on and continued for many, many centuries, really. And interestingly, in the island of Mallorca, where there was this large converted community, as Danny Rothstein, the director of Xueta Island, explains, the auto de fe continued all the way until the final one of 1691, which was known as the Great Bonfire or the Great Burning, because a number of crypto-Jews were brought before the Inquisition and in fact met that ultimate fate. They, in this 1687 to 1691 investigation by the Inquisition on the island of Mallorca, had also planned an escape. The ports were closed, but they had managed to contract with a Dutch ship captain to get them out. And they left their neighborhood, which was locked and gated. It was a kind of ghetto at night. They went to the ship, they embarked, and unfortunately, very bad weather prevented the ship from leaving the port. So they had to disembark and return to their homes, return to their quarter. And one of the people who was part of this community was an elderly woman with one of those surnames that Danny Rothstein talks about, one of those marked families. She was a mad woman. She was demented. And she started screaming and yelling in the streets. And the streets were always patrolled, as you see in 1618, by municipal authorities to keep the peace. And they heard this ruckus. They went out to investigate. They arrested, there were something like 37 of these people trying to escape. They were imprisoned, they were tried. And so their escape, and this was in 1688, was not successful. So it was a different result than what you see in 1618. This Xueta Island documentary gives you a very good history of what happened on the island and how that reverberates today. And I think it's really quite interesting how these two films talk to each other across history, across national borders of Spain and Portugal. And I guess if you would be interested in my opinion, and after this, I'm going to turn it over to chatting among you and with you. I'm always intrigued when directors take on the job of doing historical reconstructions. I thought Luís Ismael, the director of 1618, did a reasonably good job in portraying the complexities of the community and what was at stake. Personally, I thought there was a tad bit of melodrama in the acting, but that may have been a function of trying to recreate the period. And I will say the sets and the costuming looked pretty authentic, as much as I am aware of that period. If we flip over to Xueta Island, I was very excited. I teach courses on the legacy of Sepharad, the Jewish presence in Spain over the course of medieval and then modern history. And the story of the Xuetas not only is not well known until I introduce it to my students, it is not even well known in Spain outside of the island of Mallorca. So it was exciting to see someone who had taken on a documentary about this topic. And Danny Rothstein, as you can hear from his accent, is from New Jersey, right? He's got that Metro New York, New Jersey, Connecticut twang, but he settled permanently in Mallorca as of 2011. He's married to a local resident. And it was then that he began discovering the story of the Xuetas, and in fact, ended up making this documentary with two other co-writers and directors. So that being said, I was wondering if there are questions, and I'm going to look immediately in the chat because I see Shlomit Finkelstein, and thank you so much, has a really interesting question. She asks, if the Inquisition could not investigate Jews, but could investigate and bring to trial apostates, what was the motivation for Jews to convert? That is a very important question. Both in Spain and Portugal, I would say there are two categories of converts, willing and forced. And in Hebrew, there are two terms. There are meshumadim, which are converts who willingly sought out conversion, and anusim, who were forcibly converted. Why did people convert? Well, sometimes at the blade of a sword. In Spain, for instance, in 1391, a wave of what we would today call pogroms spread across what is now Spain. Many of the Jewish communities either living under the remaining parts of the peninsula further to the south that were under Muslim rule, or those who were living to the north under Christian rule. Those communities like Seville and several others were very heavily impacted. There were hundreds of Jews who were killed by mob violence. And so the conversions were often carried out forcibly. In other cases, living in a multicultural society where they were a disprivileged minority, legally speaking, often led to people thinking, if I convert, life will be just easier, right? I will go through the ritual of baptism. I will listen to whatever training or indoctrination I have to, and I will be considered a member of the Catholic faith. And then in theory, I will have a much easier time of it. And there were cases that we know of historically in both Spain and Portugal, where after listening to preachers, because one of the things that occurred was that Catholic preachers from some of the mendicant orders who traveled, particularly, I believe it was the Dominicans, were given permission to go and preach in synagogues, and the Jews were required to listen to their sermons. In some cases, there were Jews who were genuinely convinced that, in fact, the Catholic religion was the true religion. And one of the interesting examples of that in Spain, or Iberia, because Spain didn't form until Ferdinand and Isabel married in 1474 and united the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. Previously, there were all of these separate monarchies and different kingdoms. But in 1263, in Girona, well, actually in Barcelona, a disputation occurred. And a disputation was a common practice across Europe, medieval Europe, where a representative of the Jewish faith and a representative of Catholicism would have a public theological debate as to which was the true religion. And the 1263 one was quite startling. The Jewish representative was Nachmanides, very famous rabbi in Barcelona. And the Catholic disputant was Pablo Cristiani. He was a priest, and Pablo Cristiani, you can hear the very Jesuitical cast of his name, was actually a Jewish convert. He had converted to Catholicism. He had then trained for the priesthood and was a very sincere representative of the Catholic position. So that the reasons for conversion in response to Shlomit's question were varied. In some cases for religious reasons and for believing in Catholic theology. In some cases, people were somewhat indifferent to their Jewish faith and figured, much easier to convert and live as a convert. And in some cases, forcibly, they were converted. As I mentioned, on the island of Mallorca, all Jews who remained as of 1345 were forced to convert. And of course, in Spain in 1492 and in Portugal in 1497, any Jews remaining in those two states, nations, were obliged either to go through conversion or to leave. So that's a long answer, a long-winded answer to a very complicated question. So, okay, so Janet Cohen has a really interesting question as well. And this flips us over to Xueta Island. And she asks, with the long period of Xueta intermarriage among the Jewish converts and among the Jews, was there genetic disease? I have no way of answering that. I am a humanist. I am not in the natural sciences, but I'm wondering if there's anyone who's part of our virtual lobby who could tell us a little bit more about how prevalent these kinds of genetic issues are or are not when a community practices endogamy, that is marriage within just that community. Because as Xueta Island tells us, everyone was converted in Mallorca. There were technically no Jews there. They were all Catholics, some nominally, some authentically. And as the centuries went by, they were all Catholics. They really were not Jews, as we see in the contemporary documentary and the people they interview. But they were all identified by their surnames. There's something like 15, 16 surnames. The minute you hear someone is named Pina or Valls or some of the other surnames that Rothstein talks about, you know that they are descended from that community. Others would not marry them. So-called old Christians would not agree to unite with them in marriage. So they married among themselves. So I'm wondering if there's anyone on today's discussion who knows a little bit more about how prevalent genetic disorders are when there is this kind of intermarriage. And I'm hoping, maybe there's somebody who will raise a hand and give us a little information, or who might have personal experience with one of these issues. Obviously, today we know how to test for many Jewish genetic diseases, something that in medieval and early modern times, we had no instruments to be able to screen for that. I'm not seeing that. Yeah. So that's a question I think we have to keep researching. Possibly Danny Rothstein would know more about that. It's not something I've seen come up in any of the material that I've read about in what happens in the contemporary community among the Xuetas. As far as I am aware, this might be a factoid of interest. On the island of Mallorca, estimates that I have seen are that those descended who are part of the Xueta community, Jewish or not today, number about 20,000. So that is a fairly substantial number, interestingly enough. Other questions that perhaps have come up as you're thinking about what you saw in these two films. And I'd also be interested, and please feel free to jump in, don't be shy. What were your impressions watching one or the other or both of these films? Did you like them? Did they intrigue you? Did you take issue with the presentations? And the reason I ask this, particularly thinking about 1618, is here's a case of potentially exemplifying for us the advantages, but also possibly the pitfalls of taking an actual historical event and recreating it as an artwork, which could be a painting, could be a novel, or in this case, a film. And I was just wondering, if you had any reactions or to the documentary and the way that the director put it together, framed it, and presents it to all of us watching it, either on the screen at home, or I know this film has showed at other Jewish film festivals this year, so they might be watching it in the theater. So what were your impressions? If any? Oh, okay, so I do see a hand, and okay.
Yeah, it's me. I did have
Okay.
have
Yeah,
something.
Amy.
Because one of the things that I recognized with 1618 is that I was trying to track characters and found that there were a lot of characters involved in the path of that story, including a lot of Catholic priests or that hierarchy that I wasn't totally understanding. So I ended up kind of having a lingering question about who was actually like within the Inquisition and like the Catholic structure, how did all of that go through? Who's actually making the decisions? Who's actually the judge? Who's actually, that was a confusing component, because within the drama of the whole thing, I kind of lost a lot of that, probably what is very essential historical information to understanding how the Inquisition was executed in Portugal. But
Yeah, and I'm so appreciative that you brought that up, because both in Spain and in Portugal, the mechanisms were basically the same. But why that's important and why it could have indeed been confusing, and the film did not entirely make clear why that happened. There was a very symbiotic relationship between the monarchy, right, the Portuguese or Spanish state, and the Catholic Church. Today, we think of contemporary nations having separation of church and state. This was not something that existed in Portugal or Spain in the medieval period. And in fact, in Spain, separation of church and state only became written permanently into the legal system, the Constitution of 1978. When Francisco Franco died, the dictatorship was dissolved and Spain transitioned to democracy. So what happened was that the Inquisition had a very complex web that was structured as a real administrative bureaucracy. There were justices, judges who listened to the cases. There were alguaciles, or officials who did a lot of the prep work. There were notaries who transcribed every word from every witness of every trial. We have vast amounts of documentation, but only in the voice of the Catholic side, and their transcriptions of what accused and witnesses may have said about them. There was a network as well of people who ran Inquisition prisons, right? Because Suspects were often arrested, imprisoned, and remained there until their trials. So this was a very complex administrative structure. However, they collaborated with the Portuguese and the Spanish state because, as you may well imagine, the idea of persecuting, much less putting to death in the ultimate cases, heretics and apostates, was something that Jesus himself would not have endorsed. To mete out death was not something that the Catholic Church could take on its hands. So when people who were accused by the Inquisition, or in many cases, it usually happened when they were accused once and punished, they paid fines, often their goods were confiscated, but then they were returned to, as it were, civilian life. But if they were accused a second time, very rarely did they escape a death penalty. It was kind of 2 strikes and you're out. And in those cases, when they were sentenced to death, either by some form of torture or burning at the stake, this was not carried out by anyone affiliated with the Inquisition. These people were, as they said in Spanish, they were relajados, they were relaxed into the arms of the secular state, and it was officials of the state, of the Spanish government, of the monarchy in Spain and in Portugal, who took charge of those prisoners and carried out their sentences. So that is why you see that very, very complicated and potentially confusing situation in 1618. And in fact, I wanted to point out that in 1618, one of the final scenes, Father, I'm forgetting his name, who's the chief priest who's involved with the 1618 Inquisition investigation, is seen in conversation. And for those of you who are linguists, he's no longer speaking in Portuguese, he's speaking in Spanish. And the reason for that is he is talking with King Philip III. It looks like it's meant to be a reproduction of the Escorial, which was the royal complex of palace, monastery, church, and royal pantheon and library in Spain, outside of Madrid, because for approximately 15 years, the Spanish crown had actually annexed Portugal into their own kingdom. So from about 1580 until I always confuse the dates, 1630 something, Portugal was actually part of Spain. And so the story of 1618 in the film is during that. And so there you see an example of this priest high up in the inquisitional hierarchy in conversation with the Spanish king, right? So that in part explains what is going on. Just as you saw in 1618, who is enforcing peace in the streets and potentially arresting people who the Inquisition is going to investigate? It's Daniel, right? Who is one of these Jewish converts. He's a converso, but until the very end of the film, appears to be serving the state as well as the Inquisition, even though he himself also has a Jewish background. Spoiler alert at the end, he does not betray the crypto Jews, and he himself embarks with them on that ship to escape. So thank you, Amy, because that was a really important point that indeed was not clear from the film. Maybe those watching it in Portugal would have understood, but we outside that historical circuit, we would not know that. Okay, so I do see, a whole bunch of things in the chat. So, okay, one comes from Kenny Blank, who is in the back, and he asks that as a dramatization that, of course, takes a certain degree of license, He wanted to know if I thought if any aspect of the story was particularly problematic from a historical perspective as far as its accuracy. That's a tough one. I would say, by and large, it seemed to be fairly accurate. And I think one of the things that the film does get right is the fact that we tend to think that these communities were united in themselves in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period. And if you think about Xueta Island, there as well. Oh, the Converso, the Xueta population, and Jews from elsewhere, they're all one big happy Jewish community. The films, both films, portray that there are fracture lines internally. And in 1618, I think you see some of those. And the figure of Daniel, right, the municipal sort of policeman who on horseback rides around arresting people, is an example of that, until the very end where he kind of flips and says, no, I'm with you. I'm also a secret Jew, and I'm going to escape with you as well. So I think that the film does get that right. And I think the film also gets right. Do you remember that scene where they're in the marketplace and Antonio and his wife are at their stand? They sell clothes and I think furs and animal hides. And that slightly demented man comes along and starts yelling at them. And he plants a wafer, a communion wafer, so that it falls out of the pocket of a piece of clothing. And then he can accuse them of profaning the host, right, that is used in Mass for transubstantiation, the wafer representing the body of Christ, just as the wine represents the blood of Christ. And you see the crowd, kind of startles, and the authorities come by, and it's only when they shake him down and tons of these wafers fall out of his pockets, right? And so they know that it's a false accusation. I think the film does get that right. One of the things that occurred frequently, the Inquisition very much in both countries depended on creating a climate of fear and use that fear to get people, even within the converted Jewish community, to inform on each other, right? Because if I tell on my neighbor and say he lit candles on a Friday night and wouldn't turn on his oven to cook, and he wore nice clothes, and he faced in a certain direction, he faced a wall, which of course was towards Jerusalem to be able to pray. If they made those accusations against a neighbor, maybe they themselves would not fall under the scrutiny, under the lens of the Inquisition. So it was kind of the best defense is a good offense. And in some cases, the accusations had nothing to do with religion or covert Jewish worship. They had to do with somebody borrowed money from someone else and didn't want to pay back the debt. How do you get out of it? Heck, accuse the lender of that loan of being a secret Judaizer. Or someone was envious of a neighbor, or there was a domestic dispute internally to one of these convert families. People turned on each other, relatives informed on each other in some cases. And we know this because the very detailed Inquisition records, in fact, talked about that. So because they would identify each of the witnesses who spoke, and it would say so-and-so who was a nephew or a cousin or a sister-in-law of the accused said, and then they would present an accusation. And it was to deflect suspicion from themselves. So I think the film 1618 does get that correct. I am less convinced that the love interest between Antonio's daughter and Daniel has a whole lot to do with it. And I simply say that because the notion of marrying for love rather than family alliances is a very modern concept. Ergo, but I think you needed something, some kind of dramatic hook for the film. And so I think that probably had much less to do historically in answer to that question. I see that Daniel Galina has a question. You've raised your hand. So what was your question or observation?
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
My question is, through your deep studies of the history of Portugal and this particular issue, do you know if any of the converted Jews that became Catholics has been canonized by the Roman Catholic Church in the centuries ahead?
I do.
As a saint, of course. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually do not know that. And I'm a little less familiar as well with the Portuguese situation. I will say that in Spain, there are saints who come out of converso backgrounds. So for instance, Saint Teresa, Santa Teresa de Avila, who was very prominent, she was quite an independent, very dominant figure on the Catholic scene in Spain in the early modern period, founded a whole series of convents, wrote very important doctrinal pieces. Going a few generations back, she did come out of converso lineage. But I don't know that anyone who directly converted in their own lifetime. I could not speak to whether or not they had ever been canonized. So you already have won the Stump the Moderator award for this morning. Oh, I also see a hand from Robin Luís. And I'm not sure if there's an unmuting issue, Robin, if you would like to ask a question. Or that might not be an actual raised hand.
Well, we do still have many questions in the chat that we can probably.
Yes, I'm going to turn over to the chat. Bert and Pat have a question. They say that during the walking around that they saw in Xueta Island, some passersby didn't approve about this. How come? I think what you saw translates very clearly into the fact that some of that residual resentment or discrimination of the Xueta community is still there today on the island of Mallorca. The last great inquisitional trials, as I mentioned, on the island took place and concluded in 1691. And as far as we know, that derogatory term, Xueta, or little Jew in Catalan, arose precisely in the period of those final inquisitorial trials. After that, the community lived apart. They were not able to participate in civic life the way that the rest of the community on the island could. So much so that in the 18th century, representatives who were faithful Catholics by then, this is so many years later, generations later, petitioned King Charles III back in Spain on the mainland. They sent him a petition saying, we are Catholics, we have been so for centuries, since 1345 when we were all converted. We petition for the right to be able to enter all professions freely, to join guilds for the different work that we do. We want to hold public office. We want the ability, the permission to serve in the Armada and in the army. And King Charles agreed that this was a legitimate request. He issued several pragmaticas or royal decrees, which frankly were ignored on the island. It took a really long time until they were really put into force. And I will say, in 1997, a Catalan novelist, Carmen Riera, wrote a novel called In the Distant Blue, or The Furthest Blue. It's available in English translation. You can find it on Amazon. I can put the name in the chat later. And what she does is, in novel form rather than cinematic form, she reconstructs the story of the trials of that final auto de fe in Mallorca. This was a acclaimed novel. It was the first novel written in Catalan that won one of the most important prizes for narrative in Spain. It was immediately translated into Castilian Spanish. And she got blowback. There were people who said, why does she have to bring this up? Stirring salt in old wounds. We don't need to hear about this. So there was that, and still is, that kind of resentment, as well as concern in the very Xueta community itself, that there's, I guess you would say, a concern that too much visibility is not helpful, right? This is a community that was used to flying under the radar for centuries. And the attention, the lens being turned on the story of the Xuetas and their descendants, and particularly today, when many of them are actually going through either reform or Orthodox conversion and becoming, in fact, the pillars of what is a very small Jewish community in the community center in the synagogue in Palma de Mallorca, which is the biggest city, is concerning to some within the community, because for those who are still prejudiced against Jews, and there is plenty of anti-Semitism, as well as a push for diversity in Spain, both of those tendencies exist, there is concern. So the people who were looking disapprovingly as people were doing those walks in that historical tour that Danny Rothstein is conducting may have either been members of the Xueta community who are like, dial it down, we don't need the visibility. Or there are people who frankly are still, I guess the word is prejudiced against what that community represents. And I would also say Spain, like many countries, is overrun by tourists these days and Airbnb, and it may simply have been a reaction to their city being invaded by too many foreign tourists. So that might be part of it as well. Let me see in the chat. Okay. Lois Plotkin asks if the present synagogue in Mallorca was built by modern Jews who came in modern times. To the best of my knowledge, the synagogue they're using now, yes, is a more contemporary building. We do know that there was a historical synagogue in Mallorca. It, long before the events of the 17th century, had been converted into a church. It's the Iglesia del Monte Sion, the Church of Mount Zion. So they don't use that because it's now a cathedral. But yeah, that is contemporary. Let's see, any other questions in chat? Oh, good question from Sandra Crane, who many of you will remember has also been a very important presence, particularly if you've ever been part of the Film Evaluation Committee. Sandra was one of our co-chairs, and Sandra works with the Holocaust Commission here in Georgia. And Sandra asks if Spain or Portugal have ever officially acknowledged and condemned the Inquisition, and when did textbooks report these historical events? Okay, so I can answer the second question. Textbooks didn't begin to talk about the Inquisition or the Holocaust for that matter, or the expulsion, in Spain at least, in more objective historical parameters until after the death of Franco, when curriculum was revised. I have facsimile editions of grade school textbooks, right, that were used during the Franco period, during the dictatorship, and they still talk about the role of the Inquisition, its importance in rooting out heresy, because of course under Franco, the connection between Catholicism and the state could not have been tighter, more tightly wound. And so the Inquisition was viewed as a force to bring unity to the nascent Spanish nation in 1492, because the country had been home to Jews and to Muslims as well as Christians. And this was a way of uniting, stamping out religious diversity and uniting around a common religious doctrine. So the only commentary and textbooks about Inquisition were running along those lines. I think there is clearer evidence now in historical work by scholars, and certainly in grade school and at the university level, that a much more accurate picture is being given. But we have to remember that the Spanish state is never, or the Portuguese state is never going to apologize per se for the Inquisition, because even though they worked hand in hand, they were separate as far as administrative bureaucracies and their roles. What is interesting and is a related question is whether Spain or Portugal have ever formally apologized for the expulsion, right? Yes and no. There is no one place where the Spanish government or the Portuguese government said, mea culpa, we are sorry, right? However, there is a push in both countries to recognize a multicultural history. A lot of film, and those of you who are devotees of AJFF know that we have been more and more featuring feature films and documentaries coming out of Spain and Portugal dealing with some of these issues. So there's film coming out, novels, historical fiction is being written. And many of you are aware of this. Both nations in 2015 passed laws regarding citizenship. Both in Spain and Portugal, laws were put on the books in 2015, allowing individuals living elsewhere who could substantiate their Sephardic descent, going all the way back to Portugal or to Spain, along with some very complicated documentation coming from rabbinical associations, generally in their home country, and showing connection to, in Spain at least, the rule was connection to the culture and the language. And in Spain, you had to take tests to demonstrate that. Individuals with all of that documentation have been able to apply for citizenship, both in Spain and Portugal. The law is still active in Portugal, and you can still apply. In Spain, peculiarly enough, the law was only given an open window for applications between 2015 and 2018. It was extended a year to 2019, and then no longer can you apply. There is a prologue to the law, a preamble, the text of it, that talks about the need to right historical wrongs and to welcome back to the common trunk a branch of the nation that had been unfairly severed from it in 1492. In Portugal, of course, that was 1497. But there are a lot of critiques of this law in Spain, simply because if indeed the ability to hold, and it is to have dual citizenship, both Spanish and your original citizenship, if indeed this is meant to quote unquote apologize, as is the question, why is the law not permanently valid for people to apply? That's a really good question. And I don't, that's a political hot potato. So let's see, lots more questions. Oh, okay, Robin Lewis has offered, she had a trouble with her phone, she couldn't unmute it, but Edith Stein, that is true, was a convert in more contemporary times who converted and was sainted, that is true. And I do believe that a documentary was made about her, not a documentary, a kind of historical narrative reconstruction. It was not an art festival, but I know it was out there. Okay, Kathy Jacobson, here's her opinion about the 1618. She said it seemed to be a film of a play with elegant sets, but sterile and too cleaned up to reflect the actual environment that existed at the time. I would tend to agree. Yep. Yeah, the town where they were, in Oporto looked a whole lot tidier than probably a medieval town would have looked. It would have been, what's the word, decrepit, more decrepit. So, oh, I see Susie Wilner, you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question or intervene?
Yes, Edith Stein was a cousin of, I think her name was Charlotte Sachs here in Atlanta. And I know she actually went to Rome to the beatification.
Ah.
So there is an Atlanta connection to Edith Stein.
I had no idea. Thank you for sharing that with us, because that was something I was definitely not aware of. Yeah. Any other, Georgia Jurica, sorry if I mispronounce, has a comment. She said that why were the 1618 Jews converted in the 14th century in Portugal 100 years before the Jews were expelled from Spain to Mallorca? There is a very complicated movement of Jews throughout the Iberian Peninsula in these times, right? So there were Jews on the Iberian Peninsula, including Spain and Portugal, going all the way back to Roman times. Obviously, when Spain declared the Edict of Expulsion, there were a number of Jews who just crossed the border to Portugal, and they had it okay for 5 years, and then Portugal issued its own Edict of Conversion or Expulsion. But there were Jews already living in Portugal as well. And those conversions were going on long before the expulsion. And again, in some cases, they were mass conversions in which people partook willingly. In other cases, they were forcible. There were violent attacks. There's a wonderful book by David Nierenberg called Communities of Violence, talking about, in this case, medieval Spain, but it's also applicable to Portugal, perhaps to a bit less degree. So conversions were going on all along, right? So that by the time that both countries issued their edicts of expulsion, you had in both places both an established convert community, as well as a community of those who were still out and out Jews, who would not be officially persecuted by the Inquisition as members of another faith, but who were then either forced to convert to remain or to leave. So that as well. And I don't know if anyone had any reflections. Something that struck me is the way that both films clearly have a dialogue with the contemporary moment. 1618, that date made me think of 1619. And Hannah Nicole Jones and her work on slavery in this country and the discussion of bringing enslaved individuals in a different kind of forced diaspora to the Americas, North and South, and Xueta Island as well made me think of that. And quite frankly, in this past week, looking at the story of what happened in 1618 and a similar attempt to escape that failed in Mallorca, made me think about the fact that the 21st century is a century of populations in movement, of migrants and refugees moving all over the planet, leaving Africa, leaving Latin America, coming to the Americas, going elsewhere in Europe, and now escaping Ukraine, trying to cross the border into Poland and other countries. And these are never intentional, these moments of dialogue, but I could not help but reflect upon that. So that is something to think about. As far as Xueta Island, the discussion given by the many members of the community, I think again personifies we as a Jewish community, and I speak as a member of that community, are certainly not united among ourselves either. And so you see discrepancies among those who convert formally, those who do not, but assume Jewish identity, those who are of Xueta background and say, I'm interested historically, but I am not religiously inclined at all. And then you see Jews in the Mallorca community who come from Eastern Europe, they appear to be of Ashkenazi background, who are very concerned because those who have not gone through formal conversion in their eyes are not Jewish. And they see these Xueta, now Jewish embracing individuals as dominating their community. So that is another complex element that you see in both films, historically and contemporarily. There is not unity within the Jewish community either. So I think we are just about at our time. I apologize if I have spoken more than you have, but I know it's Sunday and rainy and many people have not yet had their coffee, and that's tough. So I want to remind everyone, first of all, that voting for the Audience Awards is still available until midnight tonight. So please cast your ballots and do the same for your friends and family. If you have not yet seen either or both of these films, boy, I really do encourage you to do so. It has been wonderful to have the opportunity to hear your comments, questions, and to dialogue with you. And I hope that these two films have given you a window onto some issues that we continue to wrestle with: migration, discrimination, how minority cultures live within majority cultures, whether it's ethnically, racially, or religiously, and what it means when you self-identify in different phases and different community sectors. And I certainly hope you've enjoyed the festival overall. And remember, you have until 11:59 tonight to get in the rest of your movie watching. So thank you so much for tuning in this morning, and see you again next year at the movies.